My name is Amoga, co-founder and CEO of Carbon Origins. We're a robotics and VR company on a mission to make robots commonplace. So we're a group of scientists, engineers, and entrepreneurs. We have landed robots on Mars, we've launched suborbital rockets, we've deployed satellite constellations, developed VR technologies for Disney. We're very passionate about deep tech, and we see robotics as the future of front-end labor. And our goal is to incubate that in a location, in a place where it can get the most TLC. We originally started the company in California, but we moved to Minnesota a few months ago. Really affordable to build robots in the United States here in Minnesota. There are a lot of contract manufacturers here with the right expertise. There are other companies building robots here. It is going to be the hotbed for robot manufacturing. The reason is, if we can build Skippies, our robots, to work in the Minnesota weather and geography, they can work anywhere.
Now, when you hire someone with a disability, you've immediately led by example. You've said you trust a new perspective, that you're confident in that person, in yourself, and your team. Now, I work with a theater company, and we have signs on the wall that say, "Work your quirk," and radical inclusion. They emphasize that what makes us different gives us strength, a new perspective, a creative edge. In Cajun cooking, there's an ingredient called the lagniappe, and it's that little something something that keeps you coming back. Hire somebody with a disability. It's the lagniappe thing to do.
So, you've decided to start your own business. You have the resources to sell or the services your new customers need. So what's next? Here's a simple checklist to help you get started. First, choose your business structure. Do you want a sole proprietorship, partnership, limited liability company, or corporation? Each form has tax and financial consequences. Next, check to make sure the name you want to use for your business is available. You can do this by checking with the Minnesota Secretary of State office. If you want to be a sole proprietor, all you have to do is register the business name with the Secretary of State office. Or if your business is going to be an LLC or a corporation, when you file the business structure registration with the Secretary of State's office, that registration also includes the business name. After that, you may need to obtain federal and state tax identification numbers from the Internal Revenue Service and the Minnesota Department of Revenue. Note that some businesses won't need to take this step. Need is determined by the number of business owners, if the business will have employees, and if the business makes taxable sales or provides taxable services. Next, obtain any necessary licenses and permits from state and local government. Then you will need to buy or rent space for the business and set up phone and internet service. You'll also want to start a banking and credit relationship with a bank or other financial institution. And don't forget to write a business plan with benchmarks to guide you through business growth. We can help you.
And remember, if you need help in any of these steps, please reach out to us here at the Small Business Assistance Office. We have staff available to answer your questions.
My name is John Hauk. I am president of LightRun Incorporated. LightRun manufactures and sells a specialized unweighting tool for survivors of stroke, traumatic brain injury, and other injuries. I started out my career working for a company called Cardiac Pacemakers, then later on St. Jude Medical, along with a couple of startups in between. So I came out of the cardiac world, and Minnesota has been a great place for a medical device career. Our product has been sold and is currently being used in Hennepin County Medical Center, the VA Hospital in Minneapolis, North Memorial Hospital, and we're soon going to be delivering a system to Courage Kenny. So we are getting local traction in spite of the pandemic, and our goal is to go nationwide in 2022 and beyond.
Well, I met Andrew in 2010. He was a recent graduate from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. So he already had his education before he came to us. And he was looking for work as an architect.
And I applied for over 200 jobs all over the U.S. I applied for jobs in Hawaii, New York, Florida and didn't get any sort of response. And after I'd applied for all of those different jobs, I realized that the job market right now is really low and that I was facing discrimination, as were a lot of people with disabilities.
So he's deaf and the world is hearing, and so of course the biggest barrier for him was communication. He worked with MCIL on job interviewing skills, and he did a very nice job talking about his experience and his work qualifications, but he did struggle a little bit with the accommodation issue, and so we worked a little bit more on that.
It was my good fortune to meet Andrew back in 2007, 2008. Andrew was someone who was deaf and he had graduated from architectural school. Really my charge was, how can I help Andrew network, take smaller steps given what the economy was.
He really advocated in my job search. He wants people to get out there. He connected me with people in the field because that's what I needed. He reached out to MnDOT, the Minnesota Department of Transportation, in the Affirmative Action Office. He contacted Lynette Geschwin. She was the head of the Affirmative Action Office at MnDOT. And she was able to set up a contract job for me to inspect airport terminals. It was a fascinating job, but again, it was contract work. And they actually didn't seem to see me as a person with disabilities. Based on my resume, they said via email that they were just really impressed with my experience, and they wanted to give me a chance.
When we launched Andrew, we were not focused on his disability. We helped him develop the skills to market himself as an architect. No one with a disability gets a job because of their disability. It's all about skills, and Andrew's a perfect example of someone that took what we helped him learn and was able to independently get a job in the private sector.
Do you run a small business in Minnesota? Are you trying to expand your operations? Or need help adjusting to changes brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic? Then contact your local Small Business Development Center.
We'd like you to know that whether you're starting a brand new business, growing an existing one, or if your business needs help because of the COVID pandemic, the SBDC can provide that help, and it won't cost you a penny.
These are hard times, but if you need help with your business, Small Business Development Centers have real professionals standing by, ready to help you develop your business plan, do marketing and research, set up your accounting, gain access to capital, and much more. And they do it all for free. So contact us today at mnsbdc.com.
In Minnesota, we're training our workforce for the next chapter of the global
I
economy.
can't wait to get started on this project.
It's great hands-on practice.
I think our students will love it.
I'll bring this to the robotics lab.
Our education and business climate are among the best in the nation. And they work together to grow creative, high-skilled talent.
Can we make it this machine? The possibilities are almost endless.
We're a state that works hard, boasting one of the highest participation rates in America's workforce.
Awesome, man. This looks great. We can really do anything here.
Great things are happening in Minnesota, and we can help you thrive.
Final touch, man. Checkmate.
Join us.
Hey, my name is Amoga, co-founder and CEO of Carbon Origins. We're a robotics and VR company on a mission to make robots commonplace. So we're a group of scientists, engineers, and entrepreneurs. We have landed robots on Mars, we've launched suborbital rockets, we've deployed satellite constellations, developed VR technologies for Disney. We're very passionate about deep tech, and we see robotics as the future of front-end labor. And our goal is to incubate that in a location, in a place where it can get the most TLC. We originally started the company in California, but we moved to Minnesota a few months ago. Really affordable to build robots in the United States here in Minnesota. There are a lot of contract manufacturers here with the right expertise. There are other companies building robots here. It is going to be the hotbed for robot manufacturing. The reason is, if you can build Skippies, our robots, to work in the Minnesota weather and geography, they can work anywhere.
Now, when you hire someone with a disability, you've immediately led by example. You've said you trust a new perspective, that you're confident in that person, in yourself, and your team. Now, I work with a theater company, and we have signs on the wall that say, "Work your quirk," and radical inclusion. They emphasize that what makes us different gives us strength, a new perspective, a creative edge. In Cajun cooking, there's an ingredient called the lagniappe, and it's that little something something that keeps you coming back. Hire somebody with a disability. It's the lagniappe thing to do.
So, you've decided to start your own business. You have the resources to sell or the services your new customers need. So what's next? Here's a simple checklist to help you get started. First, choose your business structure. Do you want a sole proprietorship, partnership, limited liability company, or corporation? Each form has tax and financial consequences. Next, check to make sure the name you want to use for your business is available. You can do this by checking with the Minnesota Secretary of State office. If you want to be a sole proprietor, all you have to do is register the business name with the Secretary of State office. Or if your business is going to be an LLC or a corporation, when you file the business structure registration with the Secretary of State's office, that registration also includes the business name. After that, you may need to obtain federal and state tax identification numbers from the Internal Revenue Service and the Minnesota Department of Revenue. Note that some businesses won't need to take this step. Need is determined by the number of business owners, if the business will have employees, and if the business makes taxable sales or provides taxable services. Next, obtain any necessary licenses and permits from state and local government. Then you will need to buy or rent space for the business and set up phone and internet service. You'll also want to start a banking and credit relationship with a bank or other financial institution.
All right, well, thank you. Hello, everybody. Steve Grove here, Commissioner of the Department of Employment and Economic Development, and excited to welcome you all to the May 9th meeting of the Governor's Council on Economic Expansion. We've got an exciting agenda ahead today. We wanted to share at the start, as always, we are holding this meeting remotely, although we were in a hybrid status last week, but continue to meet remotely where we can to take consideration of people's concerns around the pandemic and for convenience sake as well. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to our co-chair, Paul Williams, to get the meeting kicked off. Paul, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you. And thanks, everybody, for taking time. And Tim Penny, welcome to you, and thank you for taking time to join us today. Just a quick word. I thought our last session in person was fabulous. The in-person gathering that we had, both just substantively, personally, it felt good to kind of get face to face with folks and to really have time to dig in. But also, I thought the content actually was really rich. So thank you. I think we're kind of at the 2/3 point through phase 2 of this process. We'll hear a little bit more later on from Liz, kind of about where we're at in that in that process. Today we're going to have a panel. Neil Kashkari is going to moderate for us. But Neil, Tracy Tapany, myself, Barty Wahi, our subgroup is responsible for the content for today. So we'll be starting with I think a fabulous panel conversation. Have a little bit of time for Q&A with the group. And then we'll have an overview kind of process and then break into our small groups for continued work. We're going to talk about a transition today where we're going to be recommending actually that staff is going to start really taking over some of the writing and composition work, and we will kind of be more kind of advisors and editors, so to speak, kind of going forward. So I think we're making good progress. Ton of heavy lifting going on by everybody. Just so appreciate your time. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Neil Kashkari to kick off our panel.
Thank you, Paul. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see you. Let me just set the stage for a moment, and then I'm going to introduce our three excellent guest speakers who we're grateful are here this afternoon. So as Paul said, our subgroup's task is to try to understand strategies to realize the vision that Minnesota will have essential drivers in place to ensure economic prosperity for all Minnesotans. So what does that mean? We've been trying, so that's Paul, Barty, Tracy, and myself, to understand what do we think are the essential drivers that need to be there so all Minnesotans can thrive in our economy. And we focus on 4 areas. It could be a lot more. Housing, making sure people have access to affordable housing. Affordable quality childcare, also essential to participating in the economy. Quality education for all Minnesota kids, absolutely fundamental. And having access to the infrastructure that they need to be able to fully participate in the economy. Those are 4 giant topics, and we've consulted with a lot of experts on each of those topics, and there are many different policy solutions that are possible. So we're not here today to talk about what those specifics are. One theme that kept coming up in our subgroup, and I think it's come up in the broader group, is how do we actually do something that moves the needle? You know, each of these 4 topics, housing, childcare, education, infrastructure, there have been many attempts over a long period of time to make a difference, and people are doing good work. People are making a difference. But if you look in the aggregate at the state level, we're barely treading water, if not falling further and further behind. So what we realized is we need to do something transformational in any of these areas if we are really going to make a difference for the future of the state and for future Minnesotans. And that means it's not the question of what specific the transformation is. It's how do we catalyze the will to actually do something transformational so we stop this behavior of just nibbling around the edges. You know, one of my observations moving to Minnesota 6.5 years ago is that Minnesota is world class. I've never lived anywhere like this. Minnesota is world class in talking about equity and talking about inclusion. But if you actually look at the results, boy, there's a giant gap between reality and the talk. And so we've asked these 3 experts to help us think about how do we actually catalyze people to move transformationally on any and all of these areas. And so let me introduce them. It's worth taking you a couple minutes to introduce them because they each have very different backgrounds and they each bring a lifetime of experience that's directly relevant here. So in no particular order, Tim Penny is president and CEO of the Southern Minnesota Initiative Foundation. He's had that role since April of 2007. Prior to that, he was a Minnesota 1st Congressional District representative in the U.S. House from 1982 to 1994. He was previously in the Minnesota State Senate, and he's also been involved in public affairs and a senior fellow at the Humphrey Institute. I think it's clear that as I've examined Tim's background, his political history, his legislative history, I look at Tim as somebody who's been able to work across party lines. He's been a Democrat, but I think he's worked very well with people on the other side of the aisle to try to drive common sense solutions forward. And he's authored a number of books on common sense and how to make politics work. And so he's from Southern Minnesota. Pleased to have Tim here with us. And by the way, Tim and I serve on the Economic Club of Minnesota Board of Directors, which he co-founded. So I've known Tim for a little while. Mai-Kau Hong is the vice president and founding dean of the Morrison Family College of Health at the University of St. Thomas. She's taken that role in 2019. Previously, for almost a decade, she was president and CEO of the Wilder Foundation in St. Paul. She's been very involved in different public sector activities and is a proven values-based leader, passionate about the well-being of underserved communities and a champion for promoting equity. I will also say Mai-Kau served for 6 years on the board of directors of the Minneapolis Fed, including serving 2 as chair. So I've had the privilege of getting to know and work with Mai-Kau very closely, and it's great to have Mai-Kau here. And last but certainly not least, Eric Jolly, PhD, is President CEO of the St. Paul and Minnesota Foundation. The St. Paul Foundation goes back a long time, from 1940, really actively involved in making grants across the community, trying to drive change. He joined the foundation in 2015, has been a lifelong educator and scientist, really focusing on building communities and community-led solutions. And so we think all three of these bring a lifetime of experience that we're going to benefit from today. So what I want to start with is ask you all, in your experience, I'm going to ask two related questions to kick off, and you can answer either or both of these, or we can circle back around if you want to answer part A and we'll come back around to part B. The two related questions are, number one, in this world that we are in today, how do we actually catalyze transformational change about any issue? Because any issue we pick, whether it's housing or it's education or it's childcare or it's infrastructure, there are going to be people who are in favor of those changes and there are going to be people who are in favor of the status quo. How do we actually drive transformational change? And then the related question is, can you think of an example in modern life when we've actually been able to implement transformational change? And I'll give you two examples that jump out for me. One example that somebody in our subcommittee mentioned to me, and I don't remember who said it, so forgive me, was seatbelt laws. 30 plus years ago, people didn't wear seatbelts very often. Now it's quite the norm. That's a pretty actually big habit change that we've made as society. Another change that's much more recent is the acceptance of gay marriage in America. In 2008 in California fancies itself a very forward-leaning state. In 2008, California amended their constitution to prohibit gay marriage. And then just a few years later, it's now the law of the land, and there's widespread acceptance in the country. So that's a pretty transformational change that's come fairly recently. So those are just two examples on the top of my mind. But maybe, I don't know who wants to go first among Tim, Eric, or Michael. Any of you? Eric, you just mentioned, so maybe I'll kick off with you, Eric. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. So I think we can look at so many places that have done this at different scales. And gay marriage, seatbelt laws are two great ones that sometimes the change came before the heart followed and sometimes not. I want to look at one or two examples where I've seen change that I think we can manage here in this state. There are two that come to mind. One is I call aggregated partnerships. I'll spend a little time talking about that. And the other one, when we have time, I'll be glad to talk about Keystone accountability. Aggregated partnerships, we've seen in the United States tremendous surge in our ability to achieve in STEM disciplines, science, technology, engineering, and math, that occurred between the year 2000 and 2008 to 2010. After that, we slowed down. I want to talk about what took us to that plateau, one way in which that happened. And in 2002, the General Electric Foundation did a survey of what works. They wanted to know, using research-based decision-making, could we increase diversity in the quantitative disciplines? And the question was, what works for whom and in what context? We researched a number of different activities, and we found there were a host of issues that were being addressed that worked to close the achievement gap. Yet we were left with that question: how can so much success add up to so little progress? We weren't closing the gap, despite the fact that all of the funded efforts were reporting to their foundation leaders success. And when we looked more closely at this, it became evident that the efforts for reform really fell into three broad categories, sometimes more than one of those three. One was engagement. Were we getting young people engaged in math and science in such a way that they had an orientation to, an interest in, and a belief that they could succeed in those disciplines? The second one were programs about capacity, making certain that students had the requisite skills and knowledge to advance to ever more rigorous disciplinary content. That is to say, you're not going to pass calculus if you haven't had algebra. So engagement, we've seen a lot of money going in, Boys and Girls Clubs, the Girl Scouts. How do you get kids excited about STEM? and some of them worked in increasing achievement. Capacity, we saw curriculum reform, teacher training, new projects, and some of those worked, and students increased achievement. And the third area we saw working on, the National Science Foundation really invested over $500 million in continuity, is what we called it, systemic reform. Are there the systemic supports, individually or collectively, in a child's life to help them move through this system? It doesn't matter how interested you are in STEM and how excited and how, if you don't achieve, you're not going to get there. But if you do achieve and your school doesn't have AP Calculus, you're not going to become an engineer. If you do achieve and you have interest and you've taken AP Calculus, but you have a need for scholarship that doesn't show up, you're not going to get there. So continuity is really about systemic reform. And what the research showed was that those that worked engagement, capacity, and continuity type of efforts succeeded when the other two elements were naturally occurring in the student's life. That at the individual level, we needed to see that every student had engagement, had capacity, and had continuity. And for some, the systems already existed. For some, they had a knowledgeable and caring adult who could walk them through the system. What happened with this effort, called the Trilogy for Student Success, was that we were able to identify a higher level goal that all of the individual players who had invested their time and effort into engagement, getting kids excited, into capacity, developing the curriculum, into continuity, make certain that no one fell through the cracks, that they could see themselves in that higher goal. And we talked about then coherence, the logical and consistent alignment among independent sectors towards a shared goal. The work was identifying that higher level goal and creating an understanding of the necessary interaction among those participants so that we could take, for example, in housing, a wide range of housing experts and experience that people are doing. Some are in finance, some are in ownership, some are in how to do your own home maintenance. How do you find that range? Create the story with the overarching goal that gives everyone a part in that story. Can we aggregate partnerships? And I'll stop there. When we have a chance later, perhaps we can talk about Keystone accountability in these systems.
Thank you, Eric. Michael?
So this is just generally answering both questions at the same time. So there are many examples when social change has actually occurred and taken root. 3 examples, I'll refer to just, evidence in all 3 of these. Recycling, there was a time in this country when recycling was not something that we had internalized as being needed for sustainability. And there was a combination of simple messaging, changes to the environment, incentives, regulation, some legal remedies, and interest groups. Mental health reform in Minnesota that went across 2.5, almost 3 decades with deinstitutionalization, the creation of facilities that would be more directed towards outpatient care for children, especially, and for adults in Minnesota. Lessons from there, using moral authority, cross-sector engagement with churches and church leaders. We saw that in the civil rights movement as well. Telling stories about mental health is different from seeing it in your family and seeing the facilities themselves. So the telling and data wasn't really enough. It was really the showing about how these children were being treated in facilities and what was actually happening to people's lives. Minnesota Coalition for the Homeless, there was a time in Minnesota when we didn't have great data around homelessness, and actually Wilder Research helped many factions, many nonprofits through the homelessness study actually collect the right information. Now, it's changing and evolving. And the reason why Wilder actually does that is not because one funder can't fund the whole thing. They could, but it's an opportunity to continuously engage the community in education about homelessness and the face of homelessness. So once every few years, deploying 1,000 volunteers from across Minnesota to have that direct engagement really matters. So yes, of course, like if there were a partner organization that wanted to fund the whole thing, but that would take away the rationale and the basis for actually educating Minnesotans about homelessness. So the organization I used to lead, the Wilder Foundation, great at doing that, trying to pull together different organizations. So common lessons and themes around how social change happens, policy change happens. By the way, policy change does reflect social change. So it is a values-based process where you're reconciling all of these and putting them into legal remedies, policy remedies. First lesson, always reframe the problem. How is the general public understanding this? We just did this through the Itasca's 1,000 Days project. How are we understanding this? Simple, concrete messages directed towards action. In other words, general awareness does not work. It has to be directed towards a bigger goal, as Eric said. Remedies are always cross-sector. Don't argue about them. Let people do it the way they want to do it. Many messengers, one story. One story, one simple story around each of these things. Varied interest groups align for collective action around a shared goal, shared vision and goals. The other one is it takes much longer than most people think. It has to be continuity across many years of action, many leaders, many institutions. You can see some of this happening via a movement type of strategy, or actually what it is growing in the nonprofit sector, collective action networks, right? Legal and regulatory, sometimes you got to sue people. You got to take direct action. Know the role you're going to play. The other is that leaders are held accountable for the results in their organizations and from a policy perspective. In other words, if they're not working the way they should be or they're not aligned, don't put them in those leadership roles. And then the last one, which is really important, is research and program evaluation is usually present. In fact, if you think about like the affordable housing, just addressing homelessness space, it was pretty disorganized. I remember a time in Minnesota when we didn't know what permanent supportive housing was. We hadn't yet figured it out, and I think it's still kind of growing. But that was actually led by a research entity, with engagement processes. So those movements can happen from different parts of society, but there has to be a really big groundswell. So, short summary: ideas, people, money. You can start in any of those three places.
Thank you, Mike. How helpful. Tim.
Okay, I'm going to focus on one of the four pillars of your upcoming report, early childhood. And I'm going to start just to give sort of my involvement in this issue. The Southern Minnesota Initiative Foundation is a regional community and economic development foundation. Our motto, serving this 20-county region in southeastern, south central Minnesota, is collaborating for regional vitality. So with the leadership of our board, we've identified 3 areas of work where we think our resources can be a helpful complement and a supplement to what others are doing to address these issues. One program area is just focused on small towns and their vitality. Another program area is entrepreneurship. We're in partnership with EDAs, chambers of commerce, local banks, etc. We are part of the ecosystem of entrepreneurship here in southern Minnesota. We do some lending, some equity funding, have some peer groups around different economic sectors and more, some training programs. But about a third of what we do here is focused on early childhood. We understand that it's both a current workforce issue, because we have single income and 2 income households where quality childcare needs are paramount on their minds. And it's also a long-term bet on a quality workforce. If these kids come to kindergarten ready to learn, they do better thereafter. If they come to kindergarten behind, they often never catch up.
And so we know that these investments matter a lot. In addition to grant programming and working with communities to address their childcare shortage issue, we also do many childcare provider trainings in our region annually. We have dozens of those trainings slated every year, and these trainings are convenient in the evening or on weekends. They allow you to get all the continuing ed credits you need to get better in your care of these children, but also to just stay licensed and stay in business. So we have adequate childcare supply here in our part of the state. And we've done a lot to promote quality as part of that, and to urge providers to get on the Parent Aware for School Readiness rating system, which then leads me to the second part of bona fides in this regard. I've been on the board of directors for the last several years of a group called Close Gaps by 5. Prior to that, it was known as the Parent Aware for School Readiness nonprofit, and prior to that, in its original years, it was called MELF, Minnesota Early Learning Foundation. And these organizations, in partnership with other organizations, Think Small, First Children's Finance, etc., these organizations have really been at the forefront of advancing quality early child care here in our state. MELF, way back in the day, 14 years ago, was founded by Dwayne Benson, a former state senator from our part of the state here in southern Minnesota, who, after leaving the legislature, led the Minnesota Business Partnership for several years. But as a legislator, he understood the important things that needed to get done in a bipartisan way. He worked with Democrats to fashion the Minnesota Care program before Obamacare was approved at the national level. He worked with then Governor Carlson to put an emphasis on quality education, including early childhood education, and other important issues. But as a leader of the premier business organization in the state, he was convinced that the future of our state's economy and our workforce really required a stronger emphasis on early childhood. So MELF raised money from corporate leaders across the state in order to fund a pilot program. And they deliberately rejected any public funding at that stage because they wanted to target a handful of early childhood sites, make sure that those sites were abiding by high quality standards, and then prove the results of that early childhood work in terms of their kindergarten readiness at the end of that experience. And several thousand students were part of that pilot program, totally funded with private resources. And that then provided the database and the results for the investment that they could take to policymakers. The second thing they did is they reached out to key leaders in both chambers and in both caucuses. Their understanding of the process was that you need champions in both chambers and in both parties, and they wanted this initiative to be embraced by leaders on both sides of the political aisle. And with the data and the results that they brought forward, they were able to secure that. They also pushed very hard, in addition to advocating for scholarships targeted to the neediest families. They pushed very hard to make sure that quality was at the top of the list. So Minnesotans now benefit from the Parent Aware for School Readiness rating system, which applies to all programs in early childhood across the entire state. And more families are benefiting from children being in those quality care settings. In addition, they then advanced early learning scholarships, and in succeeding or successive legislative sessions, they were able to get more and more dollars for the early childhood needs addressed through the scholarship approach. And they also were able to get increases in the level of financial support available through these scholarships to the neediest families, so that in fact would cover the lion's share of those early childhood costs, which we all know are quite high. So currently, we have in parent aware for school readiness quality rated programs, about 100,000 students or preschool age children. And back when this was piloted some years ago, we had barely 20,000 students in a parent aware rated quality system. So that is evidence that in this past year, we've really made quite a lot of headway, largely due to the advocacy of Close Gaps by 5 and related organizations. And then in terms of the number of kids, there were, I think, 7,000 kids that were in those pilot programs all those years ago. And in the last several years, with the scholarships being made available, about 70,000 students or preschool age children have been availed of those scholarships. There's still work to be done. Obviously, there's still about 31,000 students in our state or preschool age children in our state that could benefit, would qualify for these scholarships. So obviously, work is still being done at the state level to address that with whatever surplus dollars might be available in the budget. But this is an issue that continues to have strong bipartisan support because of the data and the results that data documents, because of the concerted effort to, from the very outset, work with both chambers and legislators from both political parties to culture and nurture champions in influential positions on both sides of the aisle, and then to collaboratively work with the other organizations that are engaged with early childhood so that we can all be, whatever else we might advocate, we can all be on the same page in terms of advocating parent aware for school readiness and scholarships targeted to the neediest families. So I think it's a classic example of how to take something from its infancy and scale it up. And we're still in the process of scaling it up, but a lot of success in a relatively short period of time.
Those are three great sets of examples, and that have given me at least a lot to think about. One observation that I have among all of your examples is they really are driven bottom up rather than top down. Or, at some point the political system has to get involved, but it seems like a lot of the early work is being done. I mean, any of the examples, even Mike, the examples you gave on recycling, I mean, I can't think of one large political figure that said, we shall recycle. It's much more driven bottom up. But I'm wondering, how do we, so things like gay marriage, things like recycling, things like early childhood education, to pick those three examples. I'm sure there are people who are opposed to it, but on some level, it's kind of hard to be opposed to it. As opposed to, let's say, housing. Let's just take housing for a second. One of the things that Paul has talked a lot about is that in addition to money to support affordable housing, we just need a lot more supply. And that means we need to mobilize the private sector, and that means we need to get our arms around local regulations that are keeping developers out, that are driving up affordable costs. The reason why I pick on that example is because then you'd have to come to my neighborhood and you'd have to convince my neighbors that we should have smaller lot sizes. And people get very protective of their neighborhoods. The reason that we have these regulations run amok across real estate is because we all want to protect our neighborhoods to prevent more supply from coming in. As much as I may say I want more affordable housing, for most people that means in somebody else's neighborhood. And so how do we confront these challenges where people are going to feel like, hey, I'm going to have to give something up in order to actually advance this? I don't feel like I have to give something up necessarily to help kids get access to quality, affordable childcare. I don't think I have to give something up personally to support recycling. I don't think I have to give something up if two other people want to get married. But when it comes down to, hey, housing, I might have to sacrifice a little bit or let go a little bit. Any ideas on how do we tackle problems like that where people are going to feel like, hey, if they gain, that's going to come at my expense?
I don't see anyone volunteering to jump in, so I'll just offer a few thoughts. What I've seen in our corner of the state, and we have huge affordable housing or workforce housing challenges here, is that communities have to pull together a coalition within the community to undertake that message of urgency. In Rochester, for example, the Rochester Area Foundation has taken this on as a priority issue, and they created a task force. They made sure that the task force was populated by people in the real estate development space, realtors, downtown business leaders, other leaders of corporations that were finding challenges with their own workforce being able to find affordable housing. And that task force then kind of came at this issue both from the standpoint of researching the need and what would it take, but also the public education piece. They then applied for and received certification as a CDFI, and they designated the greater Rochester area as the service area for whatever resources could flow through that CDFI approach, and that the whole purpose of that application was to address this issue. So it was really understood that that's the reason we want this tool. So that's Rochester, and there's probably more to be said about that, but that's one example of how one community approached it. The other community would be St. Peter, where they had a housing shortage, a need for new and affordable housing in their community. They, again, at the local level, pulled together a cross-section, very much like Rochester, of community leaders who could help identify the problem, quantify the problem, identify some of the potential solutions, and carry forward the public education piece. And then they reached out to the Southwestern Minnesota Housing Finance Agency, and they also thought creatively about tax increment financing and how some of the tools available through the city, through the EDA, could be combined with whatever resources the Housing Finance Agency could bring to the table. And they cobbled together a rather unique financing scheme that kept purchase prices and monthly costs rather low for the eligible families that bought these houses on the kind of the northwest corner of town, and again the whole goal was to keep housing costs and the monthly payments within a certain range, and everything they did was sort of driven to produce housing that met the need at the right price.
Thank you.
So, what I liked about Tim's example is he talked about restructuring the economic formula here and really looking at it differently, using TIF differently, understanding that in decreasing lot size and increasing the number of people paying taxes decreases your share is the other side of what do I lose when I open up my community? What do I gain? I gain stability in my schools. I gain stability in my tax base. I gain a lower crime rate. These are the things that happen with stable housing. And we need to capture that data as well. And we need to change the economic models that that are really built around individual investors in these properties as owners and not an aggregated property. And we need to also understand the continuum of housing isn't all single family housing. We've been working that and growing it. It's not necessarily the right point of entry.
Michael, you're muted, Michael.
Yeah, so my experience with this is that for that action around the supply to actually occur, especially in local communities, those who are living in those neighborhoods have to see a direct, tangible benefit that is connected back to their employment, their stability. I mean, all of these different things. If that connection can't get made, because money may be present, but because, well, I hate to say it, but bigotry exists as well as stigma against low-income people. Until those individuals, could be kind of like a neutral broker or coalition like Tim and Eric are talking about, but it could also just be direct education. And so I think in situations like that, nonprofits like Paul's actually need direct community action and education. I'll give you an example. We were at Wilder trying to turn what used to be a residential treatment facility for adolescents into a social healing center for refugees, and the community opposed that. We were ready to put the money in, but they really didn't understand. Like the district council did not understand what Wilder was trying to do. So we actually had our clients who were from different countries show up at the district council hearing to talk about displacement, war, why they needed support. I mean, all of these things. So I think while it's true that you can get organized, some of this is very messy. And I tell people all the time, let it be messy, because the community is trying to speak. And so one of the roles that foundations can play is actually, I was on Eric Jolly's board when we had all those protests in St. Paul with Philando Castile being shot in Falcon Heights. It wasn't the city of St. Paul, but Wilder and a whole bunch of local leaders stood up to actually coordinate action so we wouldn't have what we had when George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis. I mean, we averted that because people knew each other. So I'd say the other thing is that the personal investment of leaders in actually coalescing is super important, especially before anything happens, right? And that can be true around housing and education and other things, but we don't know each other as leaders and who has leverage in what place. We probably won't be very successful with some of these things.
I want to turn it to Paul and Barty and Tracy here, in my subcommittee members in a second. But one reaction, in economics, we often talk about an externality where I get the benefit of driving in my car. The cost of carbon is borne by society as a whole. I don't bear that cost directly, right? It's spread out. In some of these examples, it occurs to me, take housing. The benefit is to the state as a whole and the economy as a whole, but I perceive the cost is borne by me individually because you're asking me to change my neighborhood. And I think I'm not disagreeing with what you all are saying. I think it is a very difficult thing to try to say, hey, this is actually in my own narrow local self-interest, as opposed to it's in society's self-interest as well. And I think that's a fundamental challenge that we are grappling with across all of these issues that we are trying to address. But maybe I could turn it over to see if Paul, Barty, or Tracy want to chime in here.
Thanks, Neil. The great conversation, and I mean, man, we could go on for a couple of hours at least. The point that you're making there, Neil, I think is really important. All of you have talked about kind of alliances. Reaching across the aisle, cross-sector collaboration, coalition building, and the importance of framing these issues. And I think across the council we have been struggling with that. How do we really reframe these? Because every single issue area that we have been talking about in all of our subgroups really need to be framed differently, right? We've identified these areas. Healthcare, right? Childcare, housing, so forth and so on, as entrepreneurship, as areas where we need to really reframe the discussion as the future of the state, right? As central to kind of workforce stability. So Barty, I'm hoping Tracy, I think, is not on the call today. Barty, I'd like to just turn to the group as a whole and see if anybody has a couple of questions. I'm looking at our clock and we're kind of running short on time, but one or two questions from anybody in the group?
While we're waiting on questions, I simply want to back up to the early childhood and talk about how you get people engaged with this issue and embracing this issue. The Federal Reserve Board, to their credit, helped provide the data that then drove the Minnesota Early Learning Foundation and the pilot program. But that return on investment that they documented for our expenditures in quality early childhood changed everything. And you can do the same thing on housing. You can do the same thing in these other program areas. And so, whether it's the Federal Reserve helping with that research and that data, or some other organization, when you can show return on investment and results, it's, your bipartisan support is going to be almost automatic.
Steve Grove, did I see your hand up?
Yeah, Paul, thanks. Fascinating conversation, and I'm struck by this idea of what's needed to motivate people to make changes that might not seem as in their immediate self-interest. And there's probably not one answer to what that thing is, because we're talking about a lot of different factors. But public safety keeps coming up in my mind as one of them, where if you have stable housing, if you have childcare availability, if you have economic opportunity, if you have equity, then public safety, if you get to root causes of public safety challenges. I guess I just love the panel's reaction to that as a potential lane to pursue. Public safety is also part of our group's broader view of what's needed to grow our economy. But is there a sort of, I don't know, an argument there or a parallel there to put in place that would motivate some transformational movement? Or just curious people's reactions to that, or if there are other ideas. I think Mike,
that's a really big question, Steve. I've actually thought some about this. The check against government is really it's citizens in a representative democracy, and so I feel like, and my doctorate's in public administration, so I'm a student of government, governance, and so when the sovereign is not working correctly, there has to be a balance against it. And the balance is the residents and the people who elected them in the first place to create these entities. And so that has to be present, and that has to be present in order to check the power of the sovereign. In public, we see this with some of what's happening around the country, but it has to be more than that. I watched, actually, this was when I was on the Federal Reserve Bank board with the recession and the recovery from the recession. I was there for the 6 years throughout the recovery, and a new priority popped up for the Federal Reserve Bank, and that was public understanding about the Federal Reserve System and why it needs to be impartial, right? But so I'm not sure what it means for this, except it means that we have to create a space as leaders where there can be true dialogue, conversation, learning, engagement, and a reinvention of what public safety systems looks like. And in some ways, with this task force, you're kind of trying to do the same thing. It's on a big macro scale with lots of topics. But, the more we can do that, it's not that we'll turn over every rock, but that shared understanding of public safety, its functions, the check against power, how is that going to happen? Those are really important conversations, and also decisions that we need to make. Because here's the other thing is the communities I live in and have worked in, Black communities, Asian communities, Latino communities, public safety is not seen as public safety. They're the threat. Depends on your perspective. My son has been stopped, and he's a young Asian man. And it's like when Trayvon Martin was chased, threatened, all this bad stuff started happening. That was a real worry for me as a parent. So I think it's perspective taking up on behalf of all residents and citizens, and truly grappling with that. But neutralizing that means that there have to be democracy has to be restored. People have to really believe in the system, and that's going to be hard to recover from.
Marcus.
Yes, thanks. Thank you all for your great comments this afternoon. The question I have is kind of related to this, conversation here a bit around how do we reset responsibility for who owns what part of the change that we want to make here? So if we're talking about childcare, where does the state or government step in? Where does the private sector? Where does the individual or community step in? How would you all think about framing up this great reset of responsibility on how we make these changes, or make that as a factor of the narrative and how we can, bring this plan forward and these recommendations forward?
Eric, you want to take a first shot at that?
Sure. I think we need to look at the people who are already actively engaged in the dialogue and bring them on board first. This goes back to one of the tenets that Mike Howe put forward. And that is, there are a lot of people out there marching for change, but we haven't united their voice behind a single message. I think that convening, that uniting, that, I use the phrase coherence, that finding where they are logically and consistently aligned towards a single goal. And then finding a value proposition that says this reframe gives you more power, more authority, more input, more impact. If the reframe is indeed well noted, the individuals who are already out there doing the work will get behind the message and say, yes, I don't lose my place, but I gain allies. And I allow them to sing in harmony, but perhaps in a different octave. So how do we find a way to allow everyone to continue what they're doing while reorienting that message to we're giving greater authority and responsibility back at the level where change happens, which is the individual community and local community leaders. I don't think it happens by state or national legislation first. That can happen later, but we need to get that momentum going and finding that message. That's where I see it happening, Marcus.
This conversation is, it's fascinating. As Paul said, we could go for easily another hour. If you look behind me, I'm an amateur history junkie. And what occurs to me as I listen to this conversation is it's a question, which is in American history, of all the history books I read, you'll often read about some remarkable leader, whether it's FDR putting in big sweeping changes in society, or Lincoln. Forget the Civil War for a moment, but that's a huge deal. But Lincoln, the Transcontinental Railroad, he signed legislation creating that, or land grant colleges was also Lincoln, all across the country. But what history books don't often write about is what the early work was that led to that moment. They write about Lincoln signing it, but they don't write about were people working on that for years or decades to lay the groundwork, or maybe it was a bold leader taking that step in those moments, and now society is different, and now society is much more has to be driven from the bottom up. And I don't have an answer to that, but you all have given me a lot to think about.
So let's go to Lincoln. Lincoln also founded the National Academies of Sciences and Engineering. He did that on the back of science organizations that were yearning for a voice in policy. They were already there, they were disconnected, and what he really did was found a way to give them all a unified platform to focus their energy in one source. And they were there for decades before. They were asking for a voice, but they didn't have a platform, and this was a unified platform. How can we give people a platform that allows them to unify their voice in a way that makes their call for change seem broader, larger, and more inclusive than it has to date? Love that example, Leo.
So just to our staff, I'm going to take a few more minutes here just to finish this up, and just Mike Howe, Tim, any closing thoughts on this question or just kind of our broader topic here?
Yeah, well, maybe just the final thought is, on housing, childcare, education, access to infrastructure, all things I've worked on in my career, actually. The leveling the field with economic opportunity is really around it's really around opportunity and reducing poverty, and not seeing poverty as a detriment to anything. In other words, it's lacking financial means, not social means. You're lacking social networks. But so many of the issues that we talk about as being important to Minnesota is really about fulfilling the dreams of children and families, and ensuring that they're safe so that they can be economically productive, go to school, do all these things. So I think instead of talking about big topics, personalizing it is really important, and actually understanding that we have systems in place that actually create penalties for people who are experiencing poverty. And that, unless you have an illness or disability, you're going to get out of it, because we talk about poverty as if it's a permanent state, and it's not. It's not unless you are disabled, ill, or have some type of condition. So I would reframe this as these are problems that are solvable, and that, in many respects, we can actually make a lot of traction on so that we don't get stuck.
Just a couple quick thoughts. One is in part in answer to Marcus's question. In the early childhood example I gave, while Close Gaps by Five and its predecessor organizations were instrumental in developing the data and the return on investment, virtually every organization that advocates for early childhood has been brought into a collaboration where that's at least among the things that they advocate. So it really does bring us together to speak around one voice. And in the examples I gave on housing in Rochester and in St. Peter, when you pull together at the front end a coalition of folks who all have an interest, but maybe varying degrees of interest in the same outcome. What you try to do through the realtors, the real estate developers, et cetera, the housing advocates, is to find those areas of synergy and common ground so that you can bring all of those resources together behind a particular solution. So to me, collaboration is the key. And the last thing is government should never be seen as the sole goal here, where all of this has to roll up to some top-down solution. And government at state and federal level needs to figure out a better way to be one of those collaborators.
Fabulous. Barty, anything that you want to add at all as one of our other subcommittee members?
Well, I mean, I think I could probably ask 1,000 questions, and so I'll just keep them to myself and maybe circle back with folks at a different time. But I'm so deeply appreciative for you sharing your time and energy with us all today. It's lovely to be able to hear your good thinking as we continue to grapple with these issues.
Yeah, and I would just agree. Really, really appreciate Eric, Mike, Kyle, and Tim. That as we are closing in on kind of the last third of our process here, thinking about how do we move to larger scale change, this kind of really fit well. So just so appreciate all the work that each of you do in our community. And thanks a ton for joining us. And Neil, thank you for pulling the panel together and moderating. So, all right, our speakers, if you can drop off if you'd like. And I think I'll turn it back over to Liz to just walk through kind of next steps with us.
Thanks, Paul. I'm just going to pull up my PowerPoint super quickly. Super appreciative of our speakers today, and glad we were able to borrow some of their time. I know everyone's really busy, and yes, like everyone has said, exciting content. Good for where we're at. So the main thing I want to tell people is we have rescheduled the town hall due to the end of session and a number of other conflicts. We just felt it was a little safer to push it back to the 31st. So we will be sending an updated WebEx invite, but just so you know, instead of Wednesday the 25th, it will now be Tuesday the 31st. And it doesn't change anything else really on how we're doing it. Like Paul said, we've gotten into this like heavy staff review phase. So a couple of next steps. I think all of the subgroups are close to the point where they've identified some strategies. And we're as we've decided, and I think most of you know this, to sunset the subgroups after this meeting or shortly after this meeting, just to transition the efforts to working on things, like Paul said, from an editing lens and from a sort of large scale thinking place. So just asking people to help with the wrap up of that and the handoff to staff for the organizing and making things read similarly across the whole various collection of ideas. And then we'll come back on the 23rd, and that meeting will really kind of be a deep dive into the whole content of the roadmap. as well, and that'll be a pretty interactive and engaging meeting, and we'll try and get you materials ahead of that like we do when we get to that. A couple updates to the roadmap structure based on your feedback. So you might have seen in the email for this week, kind of a action item around if you're interested in helping staff, like in a half-hour meeting, kind of helping staff set the tone for the preamble. We've heard a lot, but if you want a little bit more of a deep dive in a writing planning session, just email Nick or Elizabeth and let us know if you want to be involved in that. And then we also want to structure the roadmap early on with a focus on the EO charge, sort of as a nice way to frame our work and call back to the executive order. So the equitable, inclusive, sustainable, resilient components that are in the executive order. So we'll work on that on the 23rd as well, kind of lifting things up into the why, into that future state thing. And then we'll have below that EO charge section, we'll have the vision statements and more detailed information on the strategies. So the roadmap outline you've been working in, I think, will stay pretty similar. And that, I think, is all we have for updates from the staff. Nick or Elizabeth, let me know if I missed anything.
Great. And do we have so any questions, comments from any council members on kind of next steps? No, I can't quite see anybody, so I don't see any hands going up. Jeff, anything that you want to add in there?
No, just in terms of this important transition from the deep work that the subcommittees have been doing to back to our collective council starting next meeting. We're clearly not trying to just sort of yank things out of people's hands. So I mean, in this transition period, if you weren't quite done yet, if you see things on May 23rd that we didn't quite capture from your group, that's not the point. Is to try to say, okay, you're done with this and we've taken this back over. It's just to have a good relay handoff and to make sure that we're now looking at it holistically and have that common approach that Liz talked about.
Thanks, Jeff. Exactly right.
Okay. Okay, so we are going to hop now over to our subgroup meetings. I see in the chat, can we just click there to join the chat?
Yes, and I believe Nick also emailed people a little bit ago. So either click the link in the chat or head over to your email.
All right, thanks everybody. Good conversation, quick conversation, I know, but really appreciate everybody's work.
Thanks all.